The first time I heard the basketball bounce on its own, I was lying in bed, the night heavy with silence. The house was old, filled with creaks and groans that were easily dismissed as the natural sounds of an aging structure. But this was different. It was a distinct, rhythmic thumping coming from the backyard, a place I had come to avoid ever since I learned about the bones. They had been discovered years ago, hidden deep within the crumbling brick wall at the far end of the yard. The discovery had sent shivers down my spine, but as time passed, the horror of it all had dulled, slipping into the recesses of my memory. Or so I thought. That night I had just turned off the lights, the darkness wrapping around me like a thick blanket, when I heard it thump, thump, thump. At first I thought it was the wind, maybe a loose shutter banging against the side of the house. But then it came again, thump, 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 with the unmistakable sound of a basketball striking the ground. I sat up in bed, my heart beginning to race. The basketball had been left in the yard earlier that day, a remnant of my attempts to relive a normal childhood, despite the eerie history of the place. But now, in the dead of night, it seemed to have a life of its own. I forced myself to listen closely, straining to catch any other sound that might explain what I was hearing. The house was still, the only noise coming from outside where the ball continued its relentless rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. My mind raced, trying to rationalize the situation. Perhaps an animal had knocked the ball over, or maybe it was simply rolling on its own. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The ball wasn't just rolling, it was bouncing, deliberately, as if someone was out there playing with it in the middle of the night. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the bedside lamp. Part of me didn't want to see what was happening outside, afraid that the reality might be worse than my imagination. But the need to know, the fear of the unknown, was stronger. I switched on the lamp, the sunlight blinding me for a moment. I blinked, trying to adjust, then slowly turned my gaze toward the window. The curtains fluttered slightly in the breeze, casting shadows that danced across the walls. I could see the outline of the backyard through the thin fabric, dark and ominous. My heart pounded in my chest as I moved closer, each step feeling like it was dragging me deeper into a nightmare. The sound of the ball grew louder, more insistent, as if urging me to come closer to see what was out there. With trembling hands, I pulled the curtains aside and peered into the night. The backyard was shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from a pale sliver of the moon that barely illuminated the old, weathered bricks of the wall. And there, at the center of the yard, was the basketball, bouncing steadily on the cracked pavement. But there was no one there. The ball moved up and down, seemingly of its own accord, with no visible force to propel it. Thump, thump, thump. My breath caught in my throat. I scanned the yard, searching for any sign of movement, anything that could explain what I was seeing. But the yard was empty, eerily still, except for the bouncing ball. The air was thick, with an unnatural silence, broken only by that incessant, maddening sound. Thump. 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 I wanted to look away, to close the curtains and retreat back into the safety of my bed, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, my eyes fixed on the impossible sight before me. A sudden chill swept through the room, making me shiver. It felt as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. My breath fogged in front of me, a stark contrast to the warmth of the night. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the bouncing stopped. The ball froze in midair for a split second before dropping to the ground with a final, echoing thud. The silence that followed was deafening, a void that pressed in on me from all sides. I stared at the ball, lying motionless now on the ground, as if mocking me, daring me to come outside and touch it. Fear gnawed at the edges of my mind, but there was something else too, a sense of dread that went beyond the fear of the unknown. It was as if the house, the yard, and everything within it were alive, watching me, waiting for my next move. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if whatever had caused that ball to bounce was still there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. I backed away from the window, my heart still racing, my mind reeling with questions. What had I just witnessed? Was it a trick of the light? A figment of my imagination? Or was it something far more sinister, something that had been awakened by the discovery of those bones? I didn't have the answers, and that terrified me more than anything. The night stretched on, long and restless. The image of that bouncing ball burned into my mind, a haunting reminder that some things are better left buried. As I lay back down, pulling the covers up to my chin, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The house, the backyard, and the secrets they held were not done with me yet. And as sleep finally claimed me, I knew that whatever was out there, whatever had caused that ball to move, was just waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again. In the days following that first night, the unsettling experience with the basketball refused to leave my mind. It lingered like a bad dream, a dark cloud casting shadows over my every thought. I tried to push it away, to convince myself it was a one-time occurrence, a trick of the mind, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The house, with its creaking floors and whispering walls, had always felt slightly off, but now it seemed alive, as if it had awoken from a long slumber. The air inside felt heavy, oppressive, filled with a presence I couldn't see but could almost sense, a lingering, watchful force that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Then the little things started happening, the small, almost imperceptible details that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. It began with the objects around the house, things I was certain I had left in one place, only to find them moved to another. A book on my bedside table, an old photograph on the mantel, even my toothbrush, all shifted, sometimes just a few inches, other times across the room entirely. At first, I thought I was just being forgetful, that maybe in my growing unease I was subconsciously moving things without realizing it. But the frequency of these occurrences quickly escalated, and I began to dread coming home, unsure of what I would find out of place next. One evening, after a particularly long and stressful day, I entered the kitchen and found the cabinets wide open, their contents neatly arranged but exposed as if someone had gone through each shelf with careful precision. I stood there frozen, staring at the open doors. I hadn't touched the cabinets that day, hadn't even been in the kitchen since breakfast. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I quickly closed them, trying to shake off the creeping fear that had settled in the pit of my stomach. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, but everything was secure. No signs of forced entry, nothing to indicate that anyone had been inside. Yet, I couldn't escape the feeling that I wasn't alone. The whispers came next. They were faint at first, barely audible, like the rustling of leaves on a distant tree. I would hear them in the early hours of the morning when the house was at its most still, just as I was on the edge of sleep. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, soft and unintelligible, but distinctly human, voices that spoke in hushed tones, as if sharing secrets just beyond my grasp. I tried to ignore them, to tell myself it was the wind, or perhaps my imagination playing tricks on me. But each night they grew louder, more insistent, until I could no longer dismiss them. One night, the whispers became so clear that I could almost make out the words, though their meaning remained elusive. They filled my room, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I squeezed my eyes shut, pulling the covers over my head in a desperate attempt to block them out. But they only grew louder, swirling around me in a maddening cacophony of half-formed sentences and broken phrases. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps as I realized the voices weren't coming from outside. They were inside, emanating from the very walls of the house. It felt as if the building itself was alive, breathing, speaking, and I was trapped within its grasp. As the days turned into weeks, the line between reality and nightmare began to blur. The whispers haunted my waking hours, echoing in the back of my mind, even as I went about my daily routine. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. My reflection in the mirror seemed off, the eyes staring back at me dull and hollow, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. My dreams were no better, filled with dark, twisted images that left me waking in a cold sweat, the echoes of the whispers still ringing in my ears. Then came the dreams that felt more like memories than mere fabrications of my mind. I would find myself standing in the backyard, staring at the old brick wall where the bones had been found. The air was thick with a suffocating fog, and the ground beneath my feet felt unstable, as if the earth itself was shifting, ready to swallow me whole. I would hear the basketball bouncing again, its rhythmic thumping filling the oppressive silence, but this time there was something else, a presence behind me, watching, waiting. I could feel its breath on the back of my neck, the hairs on my skin standing on end as I slowly turned, dreading what I might see. But before I could glimpse it, I would wake up, heart racing, drenched in sweat, with the feeling that something had followed me back from the dream. The terror was no longer confined to the night. It seeped into my days, coloring every moment with a sense of impending doom. I started questioning everything, wondering if I was losing my mind, if the house was playing tricks on me, or if there was something far more sinister at play. The final straw came when I found a note, scrawled in a handwriting that was eerily familiar, yet not my own. It was lying on the kitchen counter one morning, next to the bowl of cereal I had just poured. The message was simple, but chilling. Remember the bones. My blood ran cold as I stared at the words, the implications sinking in like a knife to the gut. The house was trying to tell me something I didn't want to hear. The past was not dead. It was very much alive, and it was coming for me. Fear gripped me, but with it came a strange, morbid curiosity. I had to know the truth, had to understand what was happening to me. But with each step I took toward uncovering the mystery, the terror grew stronger, and I began to realize that whatever was haunting this house was not going to let me go easily. It had been awakened, and now it was feeding on my fear, drawing me deeper into its web of darkness and despair. The whispers, the shifting objects, the dreams, everything was connected, part of a larger, more horrifying puzzle that I was only beginning to piece together. And as I stood in the kitchen, staring at that note, I knew that the worst was yet to come. The realization that something malevolent was at work within the house began to erode my sense of reality. I found myself slipping further into isolation, withdrawing from friends and family who couldn't possibly understand the terror that had taken hold of my life. The whispers, the moving objects, the eerie note. It all weighed heavily on my mind, twisting my thoughts until I no longer knew what was real and what was merely the product of my unraveling sanity. The whispers became a constant presence, no longer confined to the dead of night. They followed me throughout the day, faint murmurs just beyond the range of clear comprehension. I would be in the middle of a conversation, only to catch a whisper of my name, barely audible but unmistakable. It sent shivers down my spine, causing me to snap my head around, searching for the source, only to find empty rooms and cold, unfeeling walls. My heart would pound in my chest, a cold sweat breaking out as I struggled to maintain my composure. How could I explain to anyone that the house was speaking to me, that it knew things about me, my fears, my secrets, my darkest thoughts? I became suspicious of everyone around me. The once familiar faces of neighbors and acquaintances now seemed foreign, their smiles too wide, their eyes too knowing. Paranoia took root, growing like a cancer, spreading its tendrils into every corner of my mind. I began to suspect that they knew what was happening, that they were part of it somehow. Were they watching me? Were they in on the terrible secret that the house held? These questions plagued me day and night, robbing me of sleep, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I started to avoid people altogether, spending more time locked away in my room, where the walls seemed to close in tighter with each passing hour. The whispers grew louder in the silence, forming half-words and broken sentences that teased the edges of comprehension but remained frustratingly out of reach. I would sit on the edge of my bed, staring at the walls, trying to piece together what they were saying, convinced that if I could just understand, I might be able to make it stop. But the more I listened, the more disjointed and chaotic the voices became, overlapping, clashing, until they were nothing more than a maddening chorus of noise that threatened to drive me to the brink. Sleep was no refuge. My dreams, once a sanctuary, had become a battleground. Every night I found myself back in the yard, staring at the brick wall where the bones had been found. The fog was thicker now, almost tangible, pressing against my skin like a living thing. The basketball lay motionless at my feet, but I knew it was only a matter of time before it began to bounce again, its rhythmic thumping a countdown to something far worse. I would try to move, to turn away, but my feet felt rooted to the ground as if the earth had claimed me, pulling me deeper into its cold embrace. In these dreams, the whispers were no longer just whispers. They were screams, loud and piercing, filling my head with a pain so intense it felt as though my skull would crack open. Faces would emerge from the fog, twisted and distorted, their eyes hollow pits of darkness that seemed to draw me in, promising answers but offering only despair. I would wake up, gasping for breath, drenched in sweat, the echoes of those screams still reverberating in my ears. The terror didn't dissipate with the light of day. It clung to me like a second skin, making it impossible to distinguish between dream and reality. One evening, I stumbled upon a diary hidden in the attic among the dust and forgotten relics of the past. The handwriting was delicate, the ink faded, but the words within were clear. It belonged to a previous occupant of the house, someone who had lived there decades before. The entries started innocuously enough. Daily musings, notes about the weather, mentions of visitors. But soon, the tone shifted. The writer began to describe strange occurrences, the feeling of being watched, objects moving on their own, the sound of whispers in the night. My heart raced as I read on, recognizing my own experiences echoed in the pages of this long-forgotten journal. The diary spoke of a discovery, A hidden room behind the wall in the yard, sealed off and long forgotten. The writer had stumbled upon it accidentally, and what they found inside had driven them to the edge of madness. There were mentions of old, rotting bones, strange symbols etched into the walls, and a presence, dark and malevolent, that seemed to feed on the fear of those who lived in the house. The last entry was barely legible, the handwriting frantic, almost incoherent. It spoke of an overwhelming dread, a sense that the house itself was alive, and that whatever had been awakened by the discovery of that room was now free to roam. I slammed the diary shut, my hands trembling. The implications were too horrifying to fully comprehend. Was I experiencing the same fate as the previous occupant? Was the house slowly consuming me, feeding on my fear and driving me toward the same madness? The thought was too much to bear. I felt the walls closing in again, the whispers growing louder, more demanding, as if they knew I was close to uncovering the truth. I had to get out, to leave the house before it was too late. But every time I tried, something held me back. A pull, an invisible force that kept me tethered to the place. As the days wore on, my isolation deepened. The few people I had left in my life became wary, their concerned looks turning to fear as they watched me spiral. I could see it in their eyes. They were afraid of what I had become. I could hardly blame them. I barely recognized myself anymore. The house had changed me, twisted me into something unrecognizable. My thoughts were no longer my own. They were dark, fractured, tainted by the evil that seemed to seep from the very walls. One night, as I lay in bed, the whispers grew louder than ever before. They weren't just voices. They were screams, accusations, demands. They were telling me to do something I didn't want to understand but couldn't ignore. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps as I felt myself slipping further into the darkness. The presence in the house was stronger now, almost tangible, pressing down on me, filling every corner of the room with its oppressive weight. I knew then that I had crossed a line, that there was no turning back. The house had claimed me, and whatever darkness it held was now a part of me, twisting my thoughts, corrupting my mind. I was no longer in control. Something else was. And as I lay there, the screams echoing in my head, I realized with a chilling certainty that the only way to escape was to confront whatever was waiting for me in that hidden room. But I also knew that doing so might be the end of me, because whatever was in that room wasn't just waiting. It was hungry, and it had been waiting for someone like me to feed on for a very long time. The descent into madness was not immediate. It was a gradual, almost imperceptible slide into a darkness that I could neither understand nor escape. At first, it was the small things, the whispers, the shifting objects, the feeling of being watched. But soon, those minor disturbances grew into something far more sinister, as the house itself seemed to turn against me. The line between reality and nightmare began to blur, and I found myself trapped in a world where nothing could be trusted, not even my own senses. The whispers that had once been confined to the edges of my hearing now grew louder, more insistent, filling the silence of the house with their maddening chorus. They no longer waited for the quiet hours of the night, but followed me throughout the day, growing bolder with each passing hour. Sometimes I could almost make out words, accusations, warnings, pleas for help, but they would always slip away before I could fully grasp their meaning. It felt as if the house was trying to communicate with me, to tell me something that my mind wasn't ready to comprehend. The more I tried to listen, the more chaotic and fragmented the voices became, until they were nothing more than a constant, overwhelming noise that I couldn't escape. My reflection became a stranger to me. The mirror no longer showed the person I once was, but someone else entirely. Someone gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to harbor a darkness all their own. My skin was pale, almost translucent, as if the life was being drained from me, sucked into the very walls of the house. I avoided looking into mirrors, afraid of what I might see staring back at me. The reflection was always slightly off, as if a second later than it should be, as if it were watching me and not the other way around. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I would catch my reflection moving when I was perfectly still. These moments left me paralyzed with fear, but the worst part was the growing sense that this dark version of myself was trying to escape the mirror, to step into my reality. The house itself seemed to change around me. The walls, once solid and reliable, now felt as though they were closing in, tightening like a noose around my neck. I could feel the house breathing, pulsing with a life of its own, each creak and groan like a heartbeat in the dark. The rooms, once familiar, became labyrinthine, their dimensions shifting as if to confuse and disorient me. Hallways that should have been straight now twisted and turned, leading me in circles until I no longer knew where I was. Doors appeared where there should be none, leading to rooms that shouldn't exist, and when I tried to find my way back, those same doors would vanish, leaving me trapped in a space that felt both too large and too small at the same time. I began to see things, shadows that moved independently of any light source, figures standing in the corners of rooms, just out of sight, their forms flickering like a dying flame. Sometimes I would hear footsteps behind me, soft and deliberate. But when I turned, there would be nothing there, just the empty hallway stretching out into darkness. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, as if the house was rotting from the inside out. I could feel the mold growing in the walls, spreading like a disease, and with it came a sense of dread that clung to me like a second skin. The nights were the worst. Sleep was a distant memory, replaced by endless hours of staring into the darkness, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The whispers would crescendo into screams, filling my head with a sound so deafening that I thought my skull would crack under the pressure. The darkness became a living thing, moving and shifting with a malevolent intelligence, creeping closer with each passing moment. My bed, once a refuge, now felt like a trap. The sheets wrapping around me like a shroud, suffocating me with their tight embrace. I could feel something watching me from the shadows, its eyes boring into me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I would lie there, frozen with fear, unable to move, knowing that if I did, whatever was lurking in the darkness would finally make its move. And then there were the visions, hallucinations so vivid that they felt more real than the world I lived in. I would see the walls bleed, thick, dark rivulets of blood seeping from the cracks, pooling on the floor. The furniture would decay before my eyes, wood rotting and crumbling into dust, fabric tearing and fraying until there was nothing left but tatters. The windows would warp, the glass turning to a murky, opaque substance that reflected nothing but darkness. Sometimes I would see faces in the walls, twisted and contorted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes filled with a terror that mirrored my own. The most horrifying of these visions came one night when I was standing in the backyard, staring at the brick wall where the bones had been found. The fog was thick, swirling around me like a living entity, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. I could feel the ground shifting beneath me, the earth soft and yielding, as if it were ready to swallow me whole. The basketball lay at my feet, and as I stared at it, I saw something that made my blood run cold. And the ball began to move, slowly at first, then faster, bouncing on its own, just as it had that first night, but this time it wasn't alone. A shadowy figure stood behind it, barely visible through the fog, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. I couldn't make out any details, just the vague outline of a person, tall and slender, with long, spindly fingers that reached out toward the ball, toward me. The figure had no face, just a void where its features should have been, and yet I could feel its gaze piercing through me, cold and malevolent. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a fear so intense that it felt as though my heart would stop. The figure took a step forward, and the fog parted slightly, revealing more of its form. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over bones that jutted out at odd angles. It wore tattered, filthy clothing, stained with something dark and wet. And then it spoke, its voice a rasping, hollow sound that echoed in my ears, even though its mouth didn't move. "You can't escape," it said, the words cutting through the air like a knife. "You belong to this house now." The figure reached out further, its fingers inches from my face, and in that moment, I finally broke free from my paralysis. I stumbled backward, tripping over the basketball, and fell to the ground. The impact jolted me back to reality, and when I looked up, the figure was gone, the fog dissipating as if it had never been there. But the words it had spoken remained, echoing in my mind, a chilling reminder that there was no escape from the nightmare I was living. From that moment on, I knew that the house had claimed me, that whatever evil lurked within its walls had taken hold of me, and there was no escaping its grasp. The downward spiral was complete. My reality had shattered, and all that remained was the terror, the fear, and the knowledge that the house, and whatever haunted it, would never let me go. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and terror as I became consumed by the need to uncover the truth behind the house and the horrors it harbored. The figure I had seen in the backyard, with his chilling proclamation that I belonged to the house, headed my every waking moment. The fear that had once been a creeping sensation at the back of my mind was now a constant, suffocating presence. I was no longer just a prisoner of the house. I was a pawn in a game I didn't understand, a puzzle that was driving me closer to the edge of madness with each passing day. I began to obsess over every detail, every clue that might offer a glimpse into the dark history of the house. I spent hours poring over old documents, scouring through the diary I had found in the attic, and searching the internet for any mention of the house or its previous occupants. The deeper I dug, the more I uncovered, and the more I uncovered, the more the pieces of the puzzle seemed to shift and change, like a nightmare that refused to make sense. Every answer led to more questions, every revelation to more uncertainty. The diary became my guide, its pages filled with the ramblings of a mind that had clearly been driven to the brink by the same forces that now tormented me. The writer had documented everything, the whispers, the moving objects, the sense of being watched, and had even sketched crude drawings of the shadowy figure I had seen in the backyard. It was clear that they, too, had encountered the same presence, the same evil that now plagued me. But the diary's final entries were the most disturbing of all. The writer had become obsessed with a hidden room, a place they believed held the key to everything. They spoke of a terrible secret buried within the house, a secret that had been locked away for decades, if not centuries. The last entry was barely legible, the handwriting frantic and disjointed, as if written in a fit of hysteria. It spoke of an unspeakable horror, something that should never be uncovered, something that would bring doom upon anyone who dared to seek it out. Despite the warnings, I knew I had to find this hidden room. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was concealed within it was the source of the house's power, the heart of the darkness that had ensnared me. The idea terrified me, but I was driven by a desperate need to understand, to find some way to break free from the house's grip. But as I began my search, I quickly realized that the room was not going to be easy to find. The house was playing tricks on me, leading me in circles, warping its layout in ways that defied logic. Doors that had once led to familiar rooms now opened into dark, unfamiliar spaces, while hallways seemed to stretch on forever, leading me further into the labyrinthine depths of the house. The whispers were no longer just a background noise. They were now a constant, maddening presence filling my head with a chaotic cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I could barely think, let alone concentrate on my search, as the voices overlapped, contradicting each other and driving me to the brink of insanity. I would find myself standing in the middle of a room, paralyzed by the sheer volume of the noise, unable to move, as the walls seemed to close in around me, the air growing thick with the stench of decay and mold. I was losing my grip on reality, and the house was taking full advantage of my weakness, twisting my perceptions, distorting my senses, until I could no longer trust anything I saw or heard. One night, as I was searching the basement, a place I had avoided until then, knowing instinctively that it held some dark secret, I stumbled upon a small, hidden door, concealed behind a stack of old, rotting crates. The door was ancient, made of heavy, weathered wood and bound with rusted iron. It was almost as if the house itself had been trying to hide it from me, burying it beneath years of neglect and decay. My heart raced as I reached out to touch the door, my hand trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The wood was cold, unnaturally so, and as my fingers brushed against it, I felt a jolt of electricity shoot through my body, as if the door was alive, pulsing with a malevolent energy. I hesitated for a moment, my mind screaming at me to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But the pull of the mystery was too strong, the need to know too overwhelming. With a deep breath, I grasped the rusted iron handle and pulled the door open. The hinges groaned in protest, the sound echoing through the basement like the wail of a dying creature. Beyond the door was a narrow staircase, descending into darkness so thick it seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight. The air that wafted up from below was foul, heavy with the stench of rotten something else, something far worse that I couldn't quite place. I knew then that this was the place the diary had spoken of, the hidden room that held the answers I sought. But as I stood at the top of the staircase, peering into the abyss below, I was gripped by a terror so profound it nearly drove me to flee. The darkness was not just the absence of light. It was a living, breathing entity, filled with a malevolence that seemed to reach out and wrap itself around me, suffocating me with its presence. I could hear the whispers again, louder now, echoing up from the depths of the staircase, calling to me, urging me to descend. I took a step forward, then another, the stairs creaking under my weight as if they might give way at any moment and send me tumbling into the void. The air grew colder with each step, until it felt as though I was walking through a thick, icy fog. My breath came in ragged gasps, the cold seeping into my bones, numbing my limbs, slowing my movements. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were all I could hear, drowning out the sound of my own heartbeat. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, hateful, filled with a rage that made my skin crawl. Finally, I reached the bottom of the staircase and found myself standing before another door, identical to the first. My hand shook as I reached out to open it, my mind screaming at me to stop, to turn back, but I couldn't. I had come too far. The door swung open with a creak, revealing a small, windowless room, lit only by the faint glow of my flashlight. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old dusty books and strange, unidentifiable objects. But what drew my attention was the center of the room, where a large wooden table stood, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. On the table was a single object, a small ornate box made of dark wood and inlaid with silver. The box was old, its surface worn and scratched, but the intricate designs carved into it were still clearly visible. There was something about the box that filled me with a sense of dread, a feeling that whatever was inside should never be opened. But I couldn't resist. My hands moved on their own, reaching out to lift the box from the table. It was surprisingly heavy, and as I held it, I felt a strange warmth emanating from it as if it were alive. I knew I shouldn't open it. Every instinct, every fiber of my being screamed at me to put it down, to leave the room and never look back. But the whispers, the voices, they wouldn't let me. They grew louder, more demanding, until I couldn't think of anything else. I had to open the box. I had to know what was inside. With trembling hands, I lifted the lid. The box creaked open, and a foul, musty odor wafted out, filling the room with the stench of decay. Inside was a small bundle, wrapped in a piece of dark, tattered cloth. I reached out to touch it, and as I did, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, the sudden absence of noise leaving me disoriented, my ears ringing. I unwrapped the cloth, my hands shaking so badly I could barely control them. What I found inside made my blood run cold. It was a small, withered hand, no larger than that of a child, its skin leathery and blackened with age. The fingers were curled into a fist, and around the wrist was a silver bracelet, tarnished and old, but still recognizable. It was the same bracelet I had seen in the diary sketches, the one the writer had described as being worn by the figure they had seen in the backyard. The realization hit me like a blow to the chest. The figure I had seen wasn't just a ghost or a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it was connected to this hand, this horrible relic that I now held in my hands. I dropped the hand back into the box, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing in, the air growing thick and stifling. I could feel the presence of the figure again, its eyes boring into me from the shadows, its anger palpable. I had uncovered its secret, and now I was in more danger than ever before. The puzzle was complete, but the answer was more horrifying than I could have ever imagined. The house wasn't just haunted, it was cursed, its walls saturated with a darkness that had claimed the lives and souls of all who had come before me. And now, it had its sights set on me. I knew then that there was no escape. The house had trapped me, ensnared me in its web of horror, and there was nothing I could do to break free. The truth had been uncovered, but it was too late to save myself. The house, and whatever evil it contained, would never let me go. The night that everything came to a head was one I'll never forget. The house had been building up to this moment, twisting reality, eroding my sanity until there was nothing left but fear and desperation. I had uncovered the secrets it hid, but the knowledge did not bring comfort. It only deepened the nightmare. The cursed hand in the box, the whispers, the figure in the shadows. They were all pieces of a puzzle that, once assembled, revealed a truth so horrifying that it threatened to consume me entirely. The evening began with an oppressive silence, a stillness that hung in the air like the calm before a storm. I could feel the tension in the house, the walls seeming to hum with anticipation, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights sent a jolt of terror through me. I knew that something was coming, something terrible that I couldn't stop. The house had lured me in, fed on my fear, and now it was ready to show me its true face. As darkness fell, I felt an overwhelming compulsion to return to the basement, to the hidden room where I had found the cursed hand. The whispers were back, louder than ever, urging me to go, telling me that the answers I sought could only be found there. My legs moved on their own, carrying me through the twisting, shadowed hallways, down the creaking stairs and into the cold, damp depths of the house. The basement was darker than I remembered, the light from my flashlight barely piercing the thick, inky blackness that seemed to swallow everything in its path. I reached the hidden door, the same ancient weathered wood that had concealed the horrors within. It seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the wood creaking and groaning as if the door itself was alive, resisting my touch. But I had no choice. My hand grasped the cold iron handle, and with a deep breath I pulled the door open. The air that rushed out was even colder than before, carrying with it the stench of decay and something far worse, a smell that turned my stomach and made my skin crawl. The hidden room was just as I had left it, the small, windowless space, lit only by the dim glow of my flashlight. The shelves, lined with old books and strange objects, seemed to close in around me, their contents filled with the knowledge of unspeakable horrors. The wooden table at the center of the room still held the box, its lid slightly ajar, as if inviting me to look inside once more. But I didn't need to. I knew what was in there, and the mere thought of it made my blood run cold. I should have turned and fled, left the house and never looked back, but I couldn't. The whispers were insistent, almost frantic, driving me forward, deeper into the darkness. I stepped into the room, the door creaking shut behind me with a finality that sent a wave of panic through me. The air was thick, oppressive, pressing down on me from all sides, making it hard to breathe. My flashlight flickered, the beam of light sputtering as if the batteries were dying. I banged it against my palm, desperate to keep the darkness at bay, but it was no use. The light dimmed, then went out completely, plunging the room into total darkness. I was alone, trapped in the pitch-black room, with nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing and the whispers that now filled the air. But these weren't just the soft murmurs I had heard before. They were loud, angry, overlapping voices that seemed to come from all directions at once. They were speaking directly to me. Though I still couldn't make out the words, the sound was deafening, a cacophony of rage and despair that echoed through my skull, threatening to drive me mad. Suddenly, I felt a cold, clammy hand grip my shoulder. I screamed, spinning around, but there was no one there. The hand was gone, but the feeling of its icy touch lingered, sending shivers down my spine. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps as I fumbled for the door, desperate to escape. But the door wouldn't budge, as if it had been sealed shut by some unseen force. I was trapped, with no way out. Then, out of the darkness, I saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them glowing faintly in the pitch black, staring at me from every corner of the room. They were disembodied, floating in the void, their gaze cold and unforgiving. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as the eyes moved closer, circling me like vultures around a dying animal. I could feel their gaze piercing through me, as if they were stripping away every layer of my being, exposing my deepest fears, my darkest secrets. The terror was overwhelming, a suffocating wave of fear that threatened to drown me. My legs gave out, and I collapsed to the floor, curling into a ball as I tried to block out the voices, the eyes, the darkness. But it was no use. The house had me, and it wasn't going to let me go. I could feel the presence of the figure again, the one I had seen in the backyard, the one I had tried so hard to forget. It was here with me, in the room, its cold breath on the back of my neck, its bony fingers reaching out to claim me. I forced myself to look up, and there it was, standing in the middle of the room, the figure from my nightmares. It was taller than I remembered, its form more defined, more real. Its skin was a sickly gray, stretched tight over its bones. And its face, if you could call it a face, was nothing but a hollow void, a black abyss that seemed to draw in all the light, all the warmth, leaving only darkness behind. Its eyes, those terrible, glowing eyes, were fixed on me, and I knew that there was no escaping it this time. The figure reached out, its fingers brushing against my cheek, and I felt a cold so intense it burned. My skin blistered under its touch, the pain searing through me like fire. I screamed, thrashing against the invisible bonds that held me in place, but there was no escape. The figure leaned in closer, its breath rancid and cold, filling my nostrils with the stench of death. It whispered something in my ear, a single word that sent a shock of terror through my entire being. Submit. I felt my will crumble, my mind breaking under the weight of that single command. The figure had won. The house had won. I was nothing more than a pawn in their game, a vessel for their darkness. The last shred of resistance left me, and I felt myself sinking into the cold, welcoming embrace of the figure, my vision fading as the darkness closed in around me. But just as I was about to lose consciousness, something changed. The whispers stopped, the eyes blinked out, and the figure froze, its grip on me loosening. I could feel a new presence in the room, something stronger, something that the house hadn't anticipated. It was faint, barely perceptible, but it was there, a glimmer of light in the overwhelming darkness. The figure recoiled, hissing in anger, and I felt its hold on me weaken. With the last of my strength, I reached out toward the light, grasping for it like a drowning man clutches at a lifeline. The light grew stronger, brighter, and I could feel the figure retreating, its power waning. The cold that had gripped my body began to fade, replaced by a warmth that spread through me, filling me with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. The darkness lifted, and I found myself back in the basement, the hidden room gone, the door open once more. I stumbled to my feet, my body weak and trembling, but I knew I had to leave before the house could trap me again. I made my way back up the stairs, each step a struggle, as I fought against the lingering effects of the figure's touch. The house seemed to groan in protest, the walls shuddering, as if it were trying to close in on me one last time. But the light that had saved me, kept the darkness at bay, guiding me back to the surface, to the safety of the outside world. As I stepped out of the house, the air felt fresh and clean, the sky clear and bright. The whispers were gone, the presence of the figure nothing more than a distant memory. But I knew that the house wasn't truly defeated. It was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. And as I walked away, I could still feel its gaze on my back, a reminder that some horrors can never be truly escaped. But for now, I was free, and that was enough. Escaping the house should have brought relief, but instead, I found myself sinking deeper into a pit of terror that seemed inescapable. The days that followed my departure were a blur of anxiety and dread, a constant sense of being watched, hunted by an unseen force. The light that had momentarily saved me from the darkness within the house flickered and dimmed, leaving me vulnerable once again to the horrors that seemed to follow me wherever I went. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of nightmares, vivid, terrifying dreams that transported me back to the house, to the basement, to the hidden room. In these dreams, I would find myself standing before the ancient wooden door once more, the whispers louder than ever, calling my name, urging me to return. The door would creak open, revealing not the room I had left behind, but an abyss of darkness, a void that seemed to stretch on forever. I could feel the cold, clammy hands of the figure reaching out from the void, pulling me toward the edge, threatening to drag me into the darkness. I would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest as if it would explode. But it wasn't just the nightmares. The terror had seeped into my waking life as well. I began to see shadows moving in the corners of my vision, dark figures that vanished the moment I turned to look at them. The air around me felt thick, oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was alive, pressing down on me, suffocating me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, followed, even in broad daylight. No matter where I went, the sense of dread followed me, a constant companion that gnawed at my sanity. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself that it was just the after effects of the trauma I had endured. But deep down, I knew the truth. The house hadn't let me go. It had simply allowed me to leave, knowing that the real torment was only just beginning. I was no longer within its walls, but its influence still clung to me like a dark shadow that I couldn't escape. The figure, the whispers, the darkness, they were all still with me, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of the basketball bouncing. Thump, thump, thump. My blood ran cold as the sound echoed through the silence of my apartment. I knew it was impossible. The basketball was back at the house, left behind in the chaos of my escape. But the sound was real as the bed I lay in, as real as the fear that gripped my heart. The thumping continued, rhythmic and unrelenting, growing louder with each bounce. I covered my ears trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. It was inside my head, a relentless reminder that the house and everything it contained was still a part of me. Driven by a mix of terror and desperation, I got out of bed and began to search my apartment, convinced that I would find the basketball, that somehow it had followed me here. But the apartment was empty, the rooms dark and silent, with no sign of the ball or anything else that could have caused the sound. The thumping continued, louder now, as if it were coming from right outside my door. My hands shook as I reached for the doorknob, every instinct telling me not to open it, not to let whatever was out there inside. But I couldn't ignore it. I had to know. With a deep breath, I opened the door, expecting to see the dark figure or the abyss from my nightmares or worse. But the hallway was empty, eerily still, with only the dim light from the street lamp outside casting long shadows on the walls. The thumping had stopped, replaced by a silence that was even more unnerving. I stepped out into the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps as I searched for any sign of what had caused the sound. But there was nothing, just the empty hallway, stretching out into the darkness. As I turned to go back inside, I saw it, a small, dark shape lying on the floor, just a few feet away. My stomach twisted with dread as I realized what it was. The basketball, the same one I had left behind at the house, was sitting there, perfectly still, as if it had been waiting for me to find it. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible, but there was no explanation, no rational way to understand what I was seeing. The house had found a way to reach me, even here, even miles away. I backed away, fear gripping me like a vice. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the ball. It seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the dark surface almost glowing in the dim light. And then, just as I was about to turn and run, it began to move, slowly at first, then faster, rolling toward me with an unnatural speed. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the wall as the ball came to a stop just inches from my feet. The air around me grew cold, the same bone-chilling cold I had felt in the hidden room, the same cold that had accompanied the figure. I could feel its presence again, stronger than ever, as if it were standing right behind me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. Knew, then, that there was no escaping it. The house, the figure, the darkness, they were all bound to me, a part of me now, no matter where I went. The terror I had faced within the house had followed me, and there was no place I could hide from it. The basketball was just a reminder, a symbol of the power the house still held over me, a power that would never let me go. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, a wave of despair so overwhelming that I could barely breathe. The abyss that had once been confined to the basement of the house was now within me, a darkness that I carried with me, a terror that would haunt me for the rest of my days. The light that had saved me before was gone, snuffed out by the relentless darkness that now consumed my life. I picked up the basketball, my hands trembling, and turned it over in my palms. The surface was cold, slick with something wet and dark. Blood. My blood. The sight of it made my stomach churn, but I couldn't let go of the ball. It was a part of me now, just as the house was, just as the figure was. The abyss of terror that had opened beneath me was too deep, too all-encompassing to escape. I was lost, trapped in a nightmare that had no end, a darkness that would follow me wherever I went. And as I stood there, holding the ball, the whispers began again, soft at first, then louder, filling the silence with their maddening chorus. They were no longer just voices. They were a part of me, a reflection of the terror that had taken root in my soul. The house had won, and there was no escape. The abyss had claimed me, and all that was left was the darkness, the fear, and the knowledge that I would never be free. The days that followed were a blur of disorientation and unease, as if the boundaries between reality and nightmare had been irreversibly blurred. I tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, to push the horrors of the house out of my mind, but it was impossible. The darkness that had seeped into my life was too deep, too pervasive. Every corner of my world seemed touched by it. Every shadow, a potential hiding place for the figure that had haunted me. The basketball, the whispers, the cold touch of unseen hands. These were no longer just memories. They were a constant, oppressive presence, lurking at the edges of my perception. I moved through my days in a daze, my mind fogged by lack of sleep and the lingering terror that never truly left me. I would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that darted away when I turned to look, leaving me with a sense of being perpetually watched. The whispers were quieter now, more like a background hum that I couldn't quite tune out, but they were always there, a constant reminder that the house and its horrors were never far away. The fear was still there too, a gnawing dread that had taken root deep within me, making every moment a struggle to maintain my grip on reality. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky darkened to a deep, foreboding shade of blue, I found myself standing by the window, staring out into the gathering night. The street was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog, but there was something else, something just at the edge of hearing, a faint, rhythmic sound that sent a shiver down my spine. I strained to listen, my breath catching in my throat as I recognized it, the unmistakable sound of a basketball bouncing. Thump, thump, thump. It was slow, deliberate, almost as if it were counting down to something. My heart raced as I searched the darkness, my eyes scanning the street for any sign of movement. The sound grew louder, closer, and I realized with a sinking feeling that it was coming from just outside my door. My body froze, fear rooting me to the spot, as I tried to convince myself that it was impossible, that I had left the basketball behind, that it couldn't have followed me here. But the sound was real, and it was getting closer with each bounce. I forced myself to move, to step away from the window and toward the door, my legs trembling with each step. The sound was almost deafening now, as if the ball were bouncing inside my skull, each thump a hammer blow to my sanity. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, the cold metal sending a jolt of fear through me. I hesitated, my mind screaming at me not to open it, not to let whatever was out there inside. But I had to know. I had to see. With a deep breath, I twisted the knob and pulled the door open, bracing myself for what I might find on the other side. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from a flickering bulb at the far end, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like living things. And there, lying on the floor in front of my door, was the basketball. It was perfectly still, the dark surface gleaming faintly in the dim light, as if mocking me, daring me to pick it up. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the ball, a sense of overwhelming dread washing over me. I knew, deep down, that this was no ordinary basketball, that it was a symbol of something far darker, something that had followed me from the house. The whispers began again, soft and insistent, filling the silence with their maddening chorus. They spoke of secrets, of things buried deep within the walls, of a darkness that could never be escaped. I knelt down, my hands trembling, and picked up the ball. The surface was cold, slick with something wet and sticky. Blood. My blood. The sight of it made my stomach churn, but I couldn't let go. The whispers grew louder, more demanding, as if they were trying to pull me back into the darkness, to drag me back to the house and the horrors it contained. But I couldn't go back. I wouldn't. I stumbled back into my apartment, the door swinging shut behind me with a heavy thud. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in around me, the shadows darker, more menacing. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the same foul odor that had filled the hidden room in the basement. I could feel the presence of the figure again, stronger than ever, as if it were standing right behind me, its breath cold and rancid on the back of my neck. But when I turned, there was nothing there. Just the empty room, silent and still. The whispers faded into the background, a low hum that I could barely hear, but they were still there, lurking, just out of reach. The ball lay heavy in my hands, a reminder that the darkness was never far away, that it was always waiting, just beyond the edge of my perception, ready to drag me back into the abyss. I sank to the floor, the weight of the ball pulling me down, and sat there in the darkness, the room spinning around me as the fear took hold once again. I knew then that there was no escape. The house had left its mark on me, a stain that I could never wash away. The nightmares, the whispers, the darkness, they were all a part of me now, a constant reminder of the horrors I had faced and the terror that still lurked in the shadows. The days passed in a haze of fear and uncertainty, each one blending into the next, until I could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. The world outside my apartment seemed distant, unreal, as if I were trapped in a dream that I couldn't wake up from. The people I passed on the street seemed like shadows, their faces blurred, their voices muffled, as if they existed in a different reality, one that I could no longer access. The basketball remained in my apartment, a silent sentinel that watched over me with its cold, dark eyes. I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it, no matter how much I wanted to. It was a part of me now, a symbol of the darkness that had taken hold of my life. The whispers still came at night, soft and insistent, filling my dreams with images of the house, of the figure, of the abyss that I had stared into and that had stared back at me with hollow, unforgiving eyes. I knew that the terror wasn't over, that it would never be over. The house had let me go, but it had taken something from me in return. My peace, my sanity, my sense of safety. The world outside was no longer the same, no longer a place of light and warmth. It was a place of shadows, of unseen dangers, of a darkness that could never be fully escaped. The conclusion of my story was as ambiguous as the terror itself. I could no longer tell where the nightmare ended and reality began, where the darkness of the house ended and the light of the outside world began. The line between the two had blurred, leaving me trapped in a liminal space, caught between the past and the present, between the living and the dead. As I sat in the darkness of my apartment, the basketball in my hands, I realized that the house had won. It had claimed me, just as it had claimed so many before me. The figure, the whispers, the darkness. They were all still there, waiting for the right moment to strike, to drag me back into the abyss. And as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, I knew that I would never truly be free. The terror would always be with me, lurking in the shadows, a constant reminder that some horrors can never be escaped, that some nightmares never end. The final image that lingered in my mind was of the house, standing silent and still in the darkness, its windows like empty eyes staring out into the night. The house had a life of its own, a malevolent force that fed on fear and despair, and it had taken a piece of me with it when I left. I knew that I would never be the same, that the terror would follow me for the rest of my days, a shadow that I could never outrun. And as the whispers began again, soft and insistent, I realized that the story was far from over. The darkness was still there, still waiting, still hungry. And in the end, I knew that it would come for me again, that the abyss would open once more, and that I would have to face the terror that had claimed my soul.